This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by the themes and atmosphere of the Gilded Age, 1870-1900s America. While it may contain references to real events, places, or cultural practices of the period, the characters, names, and narrative are products of imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The story explores dark psychological themes, societal decay, and the fragility of human sanity, and may depict distressing elements such as betrayal, madness, and isolation. It is intended for mature audiences who appreciate dramatic, Gothic, and historical storytelling. The year was 1874, and New York City gleamed like a crown of iron and smoke, a place where wealth spilled into the streets like champagne. It was an age when names such as Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Astor shaped the skyline, when men of ruthless ambition bent steel and coal into empires, and women of elegance draped themselves in silks imported from Paris. It was in this gilded world that Clara Davenport was born. Her father, Richard Davenport, was a railroad magnate, a man with iron in his blood and ambition in his eyes. He had built his fortune across miles of steel tracks that cut through the heart of America, binding together distant towns with the promise of progress. Her mother, Eleanor Whitmore Davenport, came from old money, her lineage tied to colonial aristocracy. Their marriage had been less about love and more about legacy, a merging of new industrial wealth with ancestral prestige. From her very first breath, Clara's life was scripted not in words, but in gold. The Davenport estate, known as Marblewood Manor, stood as a symbol of extravagance. Nestled along Fifth Avenue, it was a palace in all but name. A sprawling mansion with Corinthian columns, chandeliers of Venetian crystal, and hallways where servants glided silently, as though afraid to disturb the air of wealth. In its grand ballroom, sunlight fell through stained glass windows, scattering kaleidoscopic patterns across marble floors where Clara would take her first steps. Her nursery was unlike that of ordinary children. French governesses whispered lullabies in her ear, while toys carved from ivory and imported from faraway lands were arranged neatly upon mahogany shelves. She had dolls from Paris, mechanical birds from Germany, and a gilded rocking horse with eyes painted so lifelike they seemed to watch her in the dim glow of gas lamps. But even within this glittering cage, whispers stirred. Clara's mother was known among society as graceful, yet often withdrawn. Eleanor carried an air of melancholy that not even the grandest soirees could erase. She was often seen gazing into mirrors too long, or clutching her rosary beads with trembling fingers. Some whispered that she suffered from nerves, while others suggested that the Davenport fortune was cursed, for wealth so vast never came without a shadow. Clara, as a child, absorbed these silences. She grew up in rooms filled with beauty but touched by something colder, an unseen draft, like the breath of ghosts wandering through gilded halls. Still, to the outside world, she was the picture of innocence and privilege. Newspapers that chronicled the lives of high society wrote of her birthdays, describing the elaborate parties where young Clara was dressed in lace and pearls, surrounded by other children of the elite. At one such gathering, when she was only 6, the family had imported a carousel from France, set upon the estate's gardens. The horses, carved in lacquer and gold, spun in endless circles, while Clara laughed with the carelessness of a child unaware of destiny. Yet beneath the surface of her laughter, shadows waited. Clara often dreamed strange dreams. At night, she would wake screaming from visions she could not explain, of grand ballrooms empty and silent, of chandeliers swaying without wind, of mirrors that showed not her reflection, but a hollow-eyed stranger. Servants would hush her back to sleep, and her governess would murmur that such dreams were common in children. But Eleanor, her mother, would sit beside her bed longer than necessary, her face pale, her fingers trembling against the silk coverlet. Perhaps Eleanor recognized something in Clara's fragile mind, something inherited. The Davenports spared no expense in sculpting their daughter's world. By the time Clara reached the age of 10, she had already seen more grandeur than most Americans would witness in their entire lifetimes. Every morning began not with chores or lessons at a common school, but with the chiming of the household's French mantel clock and the careful entrance of her governess, Madame Rousseau, who insisted that a young lady must begin her day with refinement. Clara's education was curated with the precision of an art gallery. Piano lessons from a German master, fencing taught by a retired French officer, and language instruction in both Latin and Italian. While other children recited nursery rhymes, Clara recited Shakespeare, her small voice echoing lines of tragedy and ambition as though rehearsing for a stage she did not yet understand. But even in her brilliance, Clara was often alone. The grand corridors of Marblewood Manor echoed with emptiness when her parents traveled, as they often did, to Newport, Boston, or Europe for business and leisure. Richard Davenport rarely spared time for his daughter beyond a few approving nods at family dinners. He was a man consumed by numbers and contracts, treating his child's existence as yet another investment, something to be cultivated, displayed, and eventually married off to secure alliances. Eleanor, by contrast, lingered in Clara's presence with an anxious tenderness, though it came filtered through bouts of her mysterious melancholy. On rare days of clarity, she would sit by Clara's side and read poetry, her voice soft as the brush of lace. But more often, Eleanor would retreat into her chambers for hours, her absence explained to Clara with evasive words. "Your mother is resting, dear," and so Clara wandered. Her footsteps became familiar to every polished corner of the estate. She memorized the patterns on the Persian carpets, traced her fingers along the cool marble banisters, and lingered in the library where the smell of leather-bound books felt like the closest thing to companionship. Among the many volumes, she found herself drawn not to fairy tales, but to darker works, Poe, Hawthorne, the Gothic romances of Europe. She read of haunted mansions and restless spirits, of minds unraveling under the weight of secrets. Though she could not have explained why, such stories spoke to something inside her. It was during one of these solitary afternoons that Clara first encountered what she would later describe as the silence that speaks. The library, with its towering shelves and tall windows, was always a place of refuge. Yet on that particular day, as dusk spilled purple shadows across the room, Clara swore she heard faint whispering. She pressed her ear against the mahogany table, then glanced toward the farthest corner where the lamplight did not quite reach. Nothing moved, and yet she felt a presence, the peculiar sensation of being watched, though she was utterly alone. When she told her governess of it, Madame Rousseau dismissed the notion with a wave of her hand. "Ah, mademoiselle, it is only your imagination. Too many ghost stories." But Eleanor, when Clara mentioned it to her later, paled and tightened her grip on her daughter's wrist. Her only reply was, "Never speak of such things again." This secrecy only made the silence heavier. By the age of 12, Clara had begun to notice how differently she moved through the world compared to other children of her rank. At social teas and garden parties, she watched the other girls giggle freely, their conversations flowing as lightly as ribbons in the breeze. Clara, though polite and admired for her beauty, felt like an observer rather than a participant. Her words seemed measured, her laughter delayed, as if she were always a beat behind the rhythm of life. And then came the incident that society would later whisper about as the Davenport oddity. During a midsummer evening in 1886, the Davenports hosted a ball so lavish that even the Astors themselves sent their regrets for not attending. The chandeliers burned with thousands of candles, the orchestra filled the hall with Strauss, and the women sparkled in gowns imported from Paris. Clara, now 14, made her first appearance as a young lady among New York's elite. Her gown was ivory satin, adorned with pearls sewn carefully into the bodice, and her hair had been arranged in elaborate curls. She looked, by all accounts, like the perfect debutante in the making. But as she descended the grand staircase, something within her shifted. Later, no one could agree on the details. Only that Clara suddenly froze halfway down, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. Some said she had seen a shadow standing among the guests. Others claimed she whispered to someone who wasn't there. Then, without a word, she clutched the banister so tightly her knuckles turned white and refused to move. Richard, mortified, rushed to her side and forced her onward, while Eleanor stood pale and silent, her rosary hidden in her hand. The orchestra continued. The guests pretended not to notice, but the whispers began before the night was over. "Did you see the Davenport girl? Strange little thing. So fragile. Perhaps she has her mother's nerves." It was the first crack in Clara's carefully gilded image. Though the incident was quickly buried by wealth and influence, Clara never forgot it. In her diary, written in careful cursive upon creamy vellum pages, she described the moment in chilling clarity. "I saw him there, though no one else did. A man in black, standing at the edge of the ballroom. His face was pale as chalk, his eyes hollow as if they were carved out. He lifted a hand, not in greeting but in command. And for a moment, I thought he would summon me away from all of it. But then Father's grip broke the spell, and the figure was gone." Her words were dismissed as fancy, the imagination of a girl too accustomed to solitude. But Clara knew better. The silence that spoke in the library had followed her into the world, and it would not let her go. The whispers from that night never fully died, though wealth has a way of muting scandal. The Davenport name was too powerful, their fortune too immense, for society to reject them outright. Still, Clara's oddness became a subject of private curiosity among the ladies of Fifth Avenue. Whenever she appeared at luncheons or concerts, eyes followed her, searching for cracks in her composure. For Clara, adolescence became a stage where she was both performer and prisoner. By 15, she was enrolled at an elite finishing school in Connecticut, a place where daughters of the nation's richest families were trained in etiquette, music, embroidery, and the art of charming conversation. The estate-turned academy stood among rolling green hills, its white-pillared facade resembling a temple of refinement. Here, girls were sculpted into ornaments for the powerful men they would someday marry. Clara excelled in every subject. She spoke French fluently, played Chopin with haunting beauty, and sketched with delicate precision. Yet her peers regarded her with a curious mixture of admiration and unease. She rarely joined their laughter, and when she did, it felt as though she were mimicking rather than participating. Her eyes often drifted toward shadows, windows, or distant corners, as if searching for something unseen. On one occasion, during a lesson in ballroom etiquette, Clara froze mid-dance. Her partner, a young instructor, described later that she had looked over his shoulder, her expression fixed on some invisible figure behind him. She whispered a phrase. No one could make out the words, then abruptly fainted. The incident was explained away as exhaustion, yet a rumor took hold. Clara Davenport was touched by spirits. Shadows of the mother during holidays, Clara returned to Marblewood Manor, only to find her mother's health declining. Eleanor's melancholy had deepened into something darker. She wandered the halls at night, speaking to portraits as though they could answer. Servants reported hearing her sobbing in empty rooms, her prayers punctuated by laughter that did not sound entirely sane. Clara, now old enough to understand the whispers surrounding her mother, began to fear that the same fate awaited her. One evening, she discovered Eleanor in the chapel room, a private space Richard had allowed his wife to design as her sanctuary. The candles burned low, casting grotesque shadows against the crucifix. Eleanor knelt, clutching the rosary so tightly her hands bled from the beads cutting into her skin. When Clara approached, Eleanor turned her face toward her daughter, eyes wild and fevered. "You see them too, don't you?" Eleanor whispered. Clara froze. "See who, mother?" Eleanor's lips trembled. "The ones who watch. They stand in the corners. They wait. Our family. It is not blessed, Clara. It is cursed. The wealth, the power, all of it is bought with promises. And promises demand a price." Before Clara could answer, Richard appeared in the doorway. His face hardened, his voice a low thunder. "Eleanor, enough." He dismissed Clara with a sharp gesture, as though shielding his daughter from her mother's madness. But Clara had heard enough. The seed of fear was planted. The Garden of Marblewood. As she grew older, Clara found solace not in society or family, but in the gardens of Marblewood Manor. It was there, among the trimmed hedges and fountains, that she could wander in silence. She often carried a sketchbook, drawing flowers, fountains, and occasionally strange faces that she insisted simply came to mind. One summer, when she was 16, a visiting guest discovered one of her sketches left on a garden bench. It depicted a figure cloaked in black, standing beneath the great oak at the edge of the estate. The detail was uncanny. The hollow eyes, the skeletal hands, the sense of presence that seemed to leap off the page. When asked who the figure was, Clara replied softly, "He is the one who waits for me." The guest laughed nervously, thinking it a childish jest. But those words lingered. The awakening of beauty, despite her peculiarities, Clara blossomed into a young woman whose beauty captured attention wherever she went. With pale skin, raven dark hair, and eyes the color of storm clouds, she embodied the romantic image of a tragic heroine. Artists requested to paint her, musicians dedicated pieces to her, and social columns wrote of her ethereal grace. Her father saw in her not fragility, but potential, a way to strengthen the Davenport legacy through marriage. He began arranging introductions with the heirs of other powerful families, the sons of steel barons, shipping magnates, and bankers. Clara attended luncheons, dinners, and soirees with them, always polite, always admired, yet always distant. She did not fall in love. In truth, she felt herself increasingly detached from the world she was being prepared to inherit. While other girls dreamed of romance and gowns, Clara dreamed of corridors lined with mirrors, of faceless men watching her sleep, of music playing in empty ballrooms where no dancers moved. A night of omen on her 17th birthday, Richard hosted another grand celebration. The mansion glittered with gaslight, the orchestra played endlessly, and Clara stood as the jewel of the evening. Yet as the clock neared midnight, something occurred that would haunt her for years. While standing near the ballroom's great windows, Clara caught her reflection in the glass. Only it was not her reflection. The figure staring back at her was older, gaunt, her eyes sunken, her mouth twisted in sorrow. For a moment, she could not breathe. She reached out, her fingers trembling against the cold glass, and whispered, "Is that me?" Guests nearby reported that Clara screamed then, collapsing in her gown of white silk. The party halted in stunned silence. Physicians rushed forward, assuring everyone it was merely a fainting spell. Yet Clara knew what she had seen. It was not a faint. It was a glimpse of what awaited her. Clara Davenport's childhood had ended that night. The golden heiress, draped in pearls and satin, had looked into the mirror of her future and found only madness staring back. The winter following her 17th birthday was bitter and long, both in weather and in spirit. Snow fell heavily across New York, blanketing Marblewood Manor in silence. Within its walls, Clara felt more trapped than ever. The grand halls no longer glittered with promise. They loomed vast and cold, like the corridors of some gilded prison. Her father, Richard, responded to the fainting incident by tightening his control. He arranged a stricter schedule of appearances, ensuring Clara was seen at operas, charity events, and luncheons. "Society must remember you as Davenport's jewel," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. To him, her beauty was currency, her name an asset. But Clara resisted in subtle ways. She smiled less, spoke less, and when asked about her suitors, she answered only with polite indifference. Beneath her compliance was a growing dread, not of men, but of the inevitable role she was expected to play: wife, hostess, ornament. Eleanor's decline meanwhile, Eleanor's condition worsened. She spent more time confined to her chambers, where heavy curtains blocked the sun and the air smelled of stale incense. Servants whispered of her erratic behavior. One claimed to have seen her speaking to empty chairs. Another swore she had woken the household by screaming in the dead of night. Clara, visiting her one evening, found Eleanor staring into a mirror. Her reflection was obscured by candle smoke, yet she spoke to it as though to another person. "They told me you would come," Eleanor murmured. "Mother, it's me, Clara," the girl whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. Eleanor flinched. "Not you. Not anymore. You look like her." "Like who?" Eleanor's lips quivered. "The one who waits in the glass." Clara shivered. The words echoed her own private terror. For years she had tried to dismiss the visions as tricks of light, imagination, or fatigue. Yet now her mother's delusions mirrored her own, as though they shared not just blood, but a curse. It was then Clara began to fear not only madness itself, but its inheritance. Society stage by 19, Clara was a figure of fascination in New York society. At soirees, women admired her gowns, men competed for her attention, and gossip columns called her the melancholy beauty of Marblewood. Yet beneath the admiration was unease. People spoke of her strangeness, her long silences, her distracted gaze, her tendency to leave crowded rooms without explanation. Some found her mystery alluring. Others whispered cruelly, "She has her mother's illness." Still, Clara performed her role. She learned how to glide across ballrooms with practiced grace, how to smile without showing the weight in her heart, how to hold conversation while her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Each event was a mask she wore, heavy and suffocating. But masks, no matter how finely crafted, always crack. The night at Newport one summer, Clara accompanied her family to their Newport residence, a grand mansion overlooking the Atlantic, where the wealthiest families gathered to flaunt their fortunes. It was there, during a seaside ball, that another unsettling episode occurred. The evening was warm, the ballroom filled with laughter and the scent of roses. Clara stood at the balcony, gazing out over the ocean, when she felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of her admirers. But no one was there, and yet, she heard a voice. It was low, almost a whisper, carried on the sea breeze. "Soon," Clara gasped, her hand gripping the railing. She spun again, searching the crowd, but found only dancing couples and glittering gowns. No one had spoken to her. She retreated inside, pale and trembling. That night, she locked her chamber doors and covered the mirrors with sheets, convinced that if she looked into one, she would not find her own face staring back. Richard's ambitions, Richard Davenport, grew impatient. His daughter's reluctance to wed had begun to draw attention. Suitors came and went, leaving with admiration but no promises. Richard could not understand her resistance. "You are not a child anymore, Clara," he told her sternly one evening, his voice echoing across the dining hall. "Our name, our fortune, they depend on alliances. You will not squander what I built with these fancies." Clara stared at her plate, silent. "Do you understand me?" She lifted her eyes, calm but resolute. "I will not marry a man I do not love." Richard slammed his glass upon the table. The crystal shattered, scattering wine like blood across the linen. "You are a Davenport. You will do as you are told." Eleanor flinched at the violence, whispering a prayer under her breath. But Clara said nothing more. Inside, however, her resolve hardened. She would not let her life be dictated by contracts of wealth. Yet she knew, in resisting her father, she risked everything: her standing, her inheritance, perhaps even her freedom. The dream on the eve of her 20th birthday, Clara dreamed a dream so vivid it would mark her forever. She stood in the grand ballroom of Marblewood, but it was empty. The chandeliers swung slowly, though no wind stirred. Music played faintly, as if from a distant room, yet the hall was deserted. Then, one by one, mirrors appeared along the walls. Each reflected her image, but each reflection was different. One showed her as a child, another as an old woman, another as a corpse with hollow eyes. At the farthest end of the hall, a figure in black stood among the mirrors, watching. He raised a hand, and the reflections shattered. Clara awoke screaming. Servants rushed to her chambers, but when they asked what had frightened her, she could not answer. She simply sat on the edge of her bed, trembling, staring at the mirror across the room. The mirror where her reflection waited, perfectly still, even as she shivered. Clara Davenport's girlhood was ending, but it was not blossoming into the ordinary womanhood society expected. Something within her had been awakened, a haunting presence that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Though her beauty continued to command attention at public gatherings, she often retreated from conversations, staring into space as if listening to voices no one else could hear. At times she would excuse herself from dinners, claiming sudden headaches, only to wander alone through Marblewood's halls until dawn. Servants reported finding her seated before darkened mirrors, whispering words they dared not repeat. Richard dismissed it as female nerves, a term doctors of the age used carelessly, but in truth, he was unsettled. Clara's eccentricities threatened to tarnish the Davenport name, and he valued reputation as much as fortune. Eleanor, frail and nearly spectral by this time, only deepened Clara's fears. Her mother's days were divided between silence and fits of hysteria. She spoke of curses, of bargains struck by ancestors, of unseen presences that lingered in the family's shadow. One night, Clara found her mother weeping by the fire. "They will take you too," Eleanor whispered, clutching Clara's hands so tightly her nails drew blood. "You are mine, but you are theirs as well. Do you not feel them?" Clara, trembling, could not deny it, for she did feel them. In every draft that crept across Marblewood's floors, in every flicker of candlelight that seemed to move against the wind, in every reflection that held too much silence. The secret journals around this time, Clara began keeping secret journals. Unlike her earlier diaries, these writings were hidden away in drawers and behind loose stones in the fireplace. They were not records of daily life, but confessions, fragmented glimpses into her troubled mind. One entry read, "I am watched, not by father, not by servants, not by society, but by something older, something patient. At times I think it is a man, at times a shadow. At times, I fear it is myself." Another, "If wealth is a blessing, why does it feel like chains around my throat? Every jewel, every gown, every gilded frame, all are heavier than stone. I envy the washerwoman who walks past our gates, for she does not carry such burdens." And another, darker still, "I dreamed again of the hall of mirrors. One by one, I saw myself die in 1,000 ways. When I awoke, my reflection smiled, though I did not." These writings, when discovered years later, would be cited as evidence of Clara's unraveling. But at the time, they remained her only outlet, a place where her fears could bleed freely onto paper. The first proposal when Clara turned 21. Her father pressed harder for marriage. Suitors were plentiful, for despite her odd reputation, her beauty and dowry were irresistible. Among them was Thomas Whitfield, heir to a banking dynasty. Handsome, confident, and widely admired, Thomas was seen by many as Clara's ideal match. During a dinner at Marblewood, Richard observed the two seated together, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Thomas spoke eloquently of politics and art, while Clara listened in silence, her gaze fixed upon the candle flames. At last, he asked her directly, "Do you enjoy music, Miss Davenport? I have a private orchestra at my family's estate in Boston." Clara blinked slowly, as though waking from a trance. "Music, yes, but I prefer silence. It speaks more truth." The table fell into uneasy quiet. Richard's jaw tightened. Later that evening, Thomas attempted to charm her again as they strolled through the garden. He leaned close, lowering his voice. "They say you are mysterious, Clara. I rather like that. Perhaps I could learn your secrets." Clara stopped, staring at him with a calm intensity. "Would you like to meet him then?" "Him?" Thomas chuckled. "Who is he?" Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "The one who waits in the shadows. He follows me everywhere. He is very patient. Perhaps one day he will follow you too." Thomas laughed at first, thinking it a jest. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw no trace of humor, only the depthless calm of someone speaking the truth. The next day he declined the match. Fractures in marble by this time, Marblewood itself had begun to feel like a reflection of Clara's mind. Beautiful, opulent, but increasingly fractured. Paintings tilted of their own accord. Gas lamps flickered though the pipes were newly fitted. Servants whispered of doors opening by themselves, of footsteps echoing in hallways long after midnight. Some claimed Clara herself was the source. They spoke of finding her wandering barefoot at dawn, her gown trailing along the marble floors, her lips moving in whispered conversation with no one. To Clara, these moments felt both terrifying and inevitable. She could no longer tell where her mind ended and the house began. Sometimes she wondered if Marblewood was alive, if the wealth her father worshipped had bound not just them, but the very stones of the estate, to some ancient hunger. The night of the portrait when Clara was 22, a celebrated painter was commissioned to capture her likeness. The portrait was intended to immortalize her beauty, to secure her place among the Davenport legacy. For hours she sat in the studio, unmoving, her gaze steady as the artist worked. When it was unveiled weeks later, the guests gasped, not because of its elegance, but because of what it revealed. Clara was painted in silk and pearls, her face luminous, her posture regal. Yet her eyes, though perfectly rendered, seemed wrong. They were too hollow, too knowing, too haunted. Some swore that if you looked long enough, you would see another face reflected faintly within them. A pale, gaunt figure, watching from the depths of her pupils. Clara stared at the painting silently. Then she whispered, "Yes, that is me." Eleanor, trembling, refused to look at it again. Richard, furious at the unsettling reaction, ordered the portrait to be hung in the East Wing, away from guests. But Clara often visited it in secret, gazing at the painted version of herself as though seeking answers. "Which one of us is real?" she once murmured aloud in the empty corridor. The silence, as always, offered no reply. By 23, Clara Davenport was no longer seen as simply eccentric. She was whispered of as fragile, haunted, perhaps even cursed. Society admired her beauty but feared her strangeness. And she herself felt it too, the slow tightening of some invisible noose, the creeping certainty that her life was not her own. The golden heiress, born into luxury, had inherited not just wealth, but something far darker. Her descent had only just begun. The year was 1887. Clara Davenport had turned 24, and despite her father's growing frustration, she remained unmarried. Yet she had become something else, a symbol. In every ball, every opera box, every illustrated column of Harper's Weekly, Clara was present. A vision in satin, pearls cascading down her throat, her pale beauty compared to marble statues of antiquity. They called her the Swan of Marblewood and the Silent Enchantress. Her silence, which had once unnerved suitors, now became part of her allure. Women envied her gowns, men wrote poems about her. Photographs of her profile circulated through society pages. She had achieved what few women of her age could. She had become an icon, admired even as she remained unattached. Yet those closest to her, her father, her dwindling circle of friends, and the servants who walked Marblewood's halls, knew that beneath the jewels shadows stirred. The grand Vanderbilt ball that winter, Clara attended the most extravagant event of the decade, the Vanderbilt Costume Ball in New York City. Over 1,000 guests filled the Fifth Avenue mansion, dressed as kings, queens, shepherdesses, and mythical gods. The newspapers would later describe it as an empire of fantasy, where fortunes glittered on the gowns alone. Clara arrived dressed as the goddess Diana. Her gown shimmered with silver thread, her dark hair adorned with a crescent moon of diamonds. She entered the ballroom with a grace that drew every eye. Even the orchestra seemed to pause as she stepped onto the marble floor. But when asked why she had chosen Diana, Clara only smiled faintly. Because she hunts alone. Throughout the evening, men approached her with compliments and offers to dance. She accepted few. Those she did, she carried out with perfect composure. Yet her partners often remarked afterward that her eyes never truly met theirs. It was as if she were dancing not with them, but with some unseen presence only she could perceive. The gilded cage, the paradox of Clara's life was this. In public, she shone brighter than ever. In private, she dimmed. When the lights of the ballrooms faded and the doors of Marblewood closed, she retreated once more into herself. Her journals grew darker. They adore me. They envy me. They fear me. Yet none of them see me. They dance with a mask, and I am the hollow beneath it. I sometimes wonder if the jewels on my neck are not stones but eyes, watching, waiting, weighing me down. At times she refused to remove her gowns after returning from events. Servants would find her still dressed at dawn, seated at her vanity, her fingers tracing invisible patterns across the glass of her mirror. The suitor of shadows among the many men who pursued her, one stood out, Henry Ashcroft, a widowed industrial magnate nearly twice her age. Unlike others, he did not attempt to flatter her with empty words. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that unsettled her, as though he recognized something in her that others missed. At a dinner party, he leaned close and whispered, "You wear your beauty like a mask, but I know what it hides." Clara froze. "And what is that, Mr. Ashcroft?" His thin smile revealed little. "A hunger, a fear, perhaps both." She excused herself from the table, trembling. That night she dreamed of him, not as he was, but as a faceless figure in black, standing at the edge of her mirror. Scandals and whispers by now. Rumors clung to Clara like perfume. Some said she had turned down over a dozen proposals, each from powerful men. Others claimed she spent nights wandering Marblewood's gardens barefoot, speaking to ghosts. A cruel column in the Evening Post labeled her the Mad Swan, though it was quickly silenced by Richard Davenport's lawyers. Still, the whispers could not be contained. In parlors and tea rooms, society speculated. Was Clara Davenport brilliant or broken, enigmatic or unhinged, a goddess or a ghost in silk? Clara herself seemed indifferent to the rumors. When one acquaintance told her bluntly that people questioned her sanity, she smiled serenely. "If they doubt my mind, then they have finally begun to see it." The mirror incident, it was during a masquerade ball at Delmonico's that Clara's facade nearly shattered. The ballroom was a blaze of candles and laughter, masks glittering with feathers and jewels. Clara, dressed in black lace and a silver mask, was dancing when she caught sight of herself in one of the great gilded mirrors lining the wall. Only it was not herself she saw. Her reflection lingered a moment too long after she turned her head, its lips curving into a smile she did not wear. She gasped, dropping her partner's hand, and stumbled backward. The crowd turned as she let out a strangled cry. Guests whispered, some laughing nervously, others unsettled. Richard hurried to her side, hissing in her ear, "Compose yourself, for God's sake." Clara forced herself to breathe, to steady her trembling hands. She offered a brittle smile to the onlookers, muttering something about fatigue. But when she returned to Marblewood that night, she tore every sheet from her bed, searching beneath it as though expecting to find someone hidden there. Her journal from that evening read only one line. "She smiled at me. I did not smile back." Eleanor's final descent as Clara's public star rose. Eleanor faded into near total obscurity. She rarely left her chambers now, and when she did, she appeared disoriented, muttering prayers or fragments of songs from her youth. Servants avoided her, calling her the ghost of Marblewood. One evening, Clara entered her mother's room and found her crouched before the mirror, scratching at its surface with her nails. Blood streaked down her hands. "Mother!" Clara cried, pulling her away. Eleanor's eyes were wild. "Don't look in, Clara. Don't let her out." Clara froze. "Her?" But Eleanor would say no more, collapsing into sobs. Clara held her trembling body long into the night, though the words repeated in her mind, "Don't let her out." Society's darling, society's prisoner despite everything. The whispers, the scandals, her mother's decline. Clara continued to reign over Gilded Age society. Her name remained in every column, her gowns described in painstaking detail, her presence demanded at every gathering. But admiration, she realized, was its own prison. She could not escape her role. To falter was to be mocked. To resist was to be ruined. She was adored but not free. In her journal, she wrote, "They think diamonds are eternal, but I know better. Even diamonds crack." This was Clara Davenport in the height of her decadence. Dazzling yet hollow, worshipped yet haunted, draped in jewels yet chained by shadows. The descent would only steepen from here. In the spring of 1889, Clara hosted her own grand ball at Marblewood, a spectacle designed to rival even the Vanderbilt gatherings. Richard spared no expense, for though he worried over Clara's strangeness, he understood that public displays of grandeur maintained their standing. The halls blazed with candlelight, orchestras played in every wing, and fountains of champagne flowed into crystal basins. Clara appeared at the head of the staircase in a gown of white silk embroidered with gold thread, her neck heavy with diamonds. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Yet even as she descended, she felt detached, as though she were watching from a distance. Every smile she gave felt rehearsed, every laugh hollow. To her, the guests seemed like painted dolls, their faces frozen in masks of greed and vanity. Later that evening, as she walked through the garden with a young baron visiting from London, he attempted to kiss her hand. Clara pulled back sharply. "Do not touch me," she whispered. "Forgive me," he stammered. "I only meant." Her eyes burned into his. "It is not you I fear. It is who might touch me through you." The baron returned to the ballroom pale and shaken. By morning, the city buzzed with rumors that the Swan of Marblewood had gone mad. The splintering circle, Clara's circle of companions, once large, dwindled. Friends who once clamored for invitations began to decline them. Suitors grew cautious, citing her delicate health. Some whispered that the Davenport fortune was cursed. Only one companion remained loyal, Margaret Fairchild, a childhood friend. Margaret, practical and kind, often visited Marblewood, sitting with Clara in the gardens or reading to her by the fire. One evening, as Margaret read aloud from Wuthering Heights, Clara interrupted suddenly. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" Clara leaned forward, her eyes wide. "The whisper behind your voice. She is mocking me, always mocking me." Margaret set down the book gently. "Clara, there's no one here but us." Clara smiled faintly, tears welling in her eyes. "That is what you think." From that night on, Margaret visited less frequently. The Ashcroft proposal. Henry Ashcroft, the widowed industrialist, returned with persistence. His interest in Clara grew as her reputation faltered, perhaps sensing both opportunity and danger. One rainy evening, he arrived at Marblewood with a proposal. Seated in the drawing room, his voice deep and commanding, he spoke of uniting their families, of providing Clara with security and companionship. Clara listened in silence, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. When he finished, she asked softly, "Do you believe in curses, Mr. Ashcroft?" He chuckled. "I believe in fortunes, Miss Davenport, and in the power of names. Curses are for peasants and poets." Clara's expression hardened. "Then you are already cursed, for you do not see the chains you wear." Ashcroft frowned, unsettled. He left that night without pressing further. But his interest in Clara never waned, and his shadow would linger in her story. The opera incident. The breaking point came at the Metropolitan Opera. Clara attended in a gown of emerald silk, diamonds glinting beneath the gaslight. The performance was Faust, and as the singers on stage enacted their tale of bargains with the devil, Clara sat rigid, her knuckles white. During the final act, she suddenly rose from her seat and cried out, "It is not a story, it is truth. He is here among us." Gasps filled the opera house. Richard tried to pull her back into her seat, but she resisted, her voice echoing, "Do you not see him? He waits in the wings." The performance halted. Society watched in stunned silence as Clara, trembling and pale, was escorted out by her father. The next day, newspapers carried scandalous headlines, "Heiress in hysteria at the opera." Though Richard paid handsomely to suppress further gossip, the damage was done. Clara was no longer merely mysterious, she was marked. Eleanor's death shortly after, Eleanor Davenport died quietly in her chamber. She had wasted away to a fragile shell, her last words whispered only to Clara. "Do not let her take you, my swan. Fight her. Promise me." Clara wept as she held her mother's frail hand, but Eleanor's eyes closed before she could ask who she was. The funeral was grand, attended by society's elite, but to Clara it felt hollow. Standing by the coffin, she whispered, "You left me with her. Now I am alone." From that day her descent quickened. The fractured heiress by 29, Clara Davenport was both the most admired and most feared woman in New York society. Invitations still came, but often out of curiosity rather than admiration. People wanted to see the Swan of Marblewood, to witness whether she would dazzle or unravel. And unravel she did. At a ball hosted by the Ashtors, she was seen speaking to a mirror as if it were a companion. At another, she stood motionless for nearly an hour, staring at a chandelier until guests whispered nervously. Her journals grew darker still. I am no longer sure if I am Clara Davenport, or if she has already taken me. The diamonds whisper, the mirrors smile. I am a puppet, and the strings are invisible. If madness is chains, then sanity is the executioner. The turning point on the eve of her 30th birthday, Clara hosted a small gathering at Marblewood. Only a handful of loyal families attended. As the guests toasted her, Clara stood, lifting her glass with trembling hands. You toast to me, she said, her voice soft but steady. But you do not know who you toast to, for I am already gone. She wears my face now. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. One lady fainted. Richard, furious, ended the evening abruptly. But Clara's words would echo in the minds of those present for years to come. The mask of diamonds and decadence had slipped. What remained was something society could neither understand nor forgive. By the early 1890s, Clara Davenport was no longer the untouched jewel of Gilded Age society. The scandals at the opera, the whispers at the Astor Ball, and the unsettling decline of her mother had left her vulnerable. Yet society still circled her, not out of admiration now, but out of fascination, curiosity, and greed. It was during this fragile period that Henry Ashcroft returned into her life with greater determination than ever. A man twice her age, his wealth came from railroads and coal, his fortune vast enough to rival the Vanderbilts. Many whispered that Clara had little choice but to accept him, for her father, too, was beginning to suffer financially after years of extravagant entertaining and speculation. Ashcroft proposed in the winter of 1891. This time, Clara said yes. The marriage was announced with pomp and ceremony, the newspapers hailing it as a grand union between two powerful families. On the day itself, Clara wore a gown of ivory satin and lace, her face veiled, her expression unreadable. Guests later remarked that she looked less like a bride and more like a figure in mourning. When the priest asked if she took Henry Ashcroft as her husband, her lips barely moved as she whispered, I do. The city cheered the match. Marblewood was decorated in flowers, the reception spilling over with champagne, waltzes, and speeches. But those who looked closely noticed that Clara never smiled. Life with Ashcroft marriage did not soften Clara's dissent. Ashcroft was a man of control, cold, calculating, and often cruel in his silences. He did not beat her, nor did he raise his voice, but his dominance lay in subtle gestures. A tightening of the jaw when she spoke too freely, a possessive grip of her arm when she strayed from his side at a gathering. Clara, who once glided like a swan through society, now seemed more like a caged bird. She attended fewer events, and when she did, she appeared ghostly, thin, pale, with eyes that darted to mirrors as though fearing what she might see reflected. At home, the marriage grew darker. Servants whispered that the Ashcrofts' Manhattan townhouse echoed with Clara's sobs late at night. They claimed she often locked herself in her chamber, refusing to eat, her journals filling with frantic writing. He does not love me. He watches me. He feeds her, the one in the mirror. He knows. The first betrayal. Clara soon learned that Ashcroft had little interest in her beyond her name and beauty. Within a year of their marriage, rumors spread that he was entertaining mistresses in his private offices and even abroad. Clara confronted him once, trembling, tears staining her cheeks. You shame me, she whispered. Ashcroft regarded her with cold amusement. My dear Clara, you are not ashamed because of me. You are ashamed because they see through you. They see what you are. When she pressed him to explain, he leaned close, his voice low. You are not the Swan of Marblewood. You are the cracked mirror behind the mask. And one day, everyone will see it. Clara fled the room, sobbing. That night, She scratched at her mirror until blood ran down her arms. Isolation society, once enraptured by her, now turned cruel. Gossip columns delighted in describing her melancholy, mocking her withdrawal from public life. Some called her the ghost bride. Others claimed she wandered the halls of Ashcroft's mansion barefoot, speaking to the air. Richard Davenport, weakened by age and financial loss, could no longer shield her from scandal. Marblewood itself began to fall into disrepair, its gardens overgrown, its marble floors dull. Clara's world shrank to her chamber, her journals, and the haunting presence she believed lived within the glass. I see her more clearly now. She wears my gown. She smiles when I cry. Soon she will step through. The second betrayal, the final blow, came when Clara discovered that Ashcroft had arranged to sell off portions of Marblewood's land to cover his failing investments. Marblewood, her sanctuary, her prison, the heart of her family's legacy, was being dismantled piece by piece. When she confronted him, her voice shaking with fury, he only sneered. Marblewood was never yours, Clara. It was your father's, then mine. You are but a shadow haunting its halls. For Clara, this betrayal was unbearable. She began to waste away, refusing meals, her journals filled with frantic scrawls of ink, sometimes smeared with tears, sometimes with blood. He has taken everything, my home, my name, my mind. But she waits for me, in the glass. Perhaps I belong with her. By 1893, Clara Davenport's life had become a precarious balance between public admiration and private torment. The gilded halls of Marblewood and the opulent ballrooms of New York no longer offered her comfort. Instead, they had become mirrors reflecting her unraveling mind. The scandals surrounding her marriage to Henry Ashcroft had begun to dominate society columns. Every whispered rumor, every slight tremor of her hand, and every pale, distant gaze was dissected by journalists eager to expose the fallen Swan of Marblewood. Headlines branded her fragile, erratic, and increasingly dangerous. Public humiliation, the opera season, was particularly brutal. At a performance of La Traviata, Clara was photographed leaning against a marble column, her face pale and drawn. The next day, newspapers ran articles questioning her health and her sanity. Society ladies whispered behind fans, calling her the ghost bride or the shadow in silk. Men who had once vied for her attention now avoided her, fearful of the rumors and the reputation that now clung to her like a shadow. Clara noticed it all, every stare, every murmur. She withdrew further into her private world, walking Marblewood's halls at night, often speaking aloud to the figure she called her. The presence in the mirror who seemed to watch and judge her every move. They do not see her. Only I see her. And soon, so will they. Isolation and obsession. Henry Ashcroft, her husband, grew more distant. He had begun to court other women openly, caring little for the whispers of society. Clara's attempts to confront him were met with cold indifference. She became a recluse in her own home, her life reduced to long hours staring into mirrors, pacing endless corridors, and writing feverishly in her journals. The halls are empty. The mirrors are full. I am not alone. She follows me, always. Her obsession with the figure in the glass consumed her. Sometimes she would sit for hours, speaking to her reflection as though it were another person. The servants began to avoid her chambers entirely, claiming she muttered threats at unseen presences, her voice rising to anguished shrieks at night. Social rejection. Invitations to society events dried up. Friends distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with the scandalous heiress. Margaret Fairchild, her childhood confidant, visited less and less, eventually cutting off all contact, leaving Clara truly alone. Even her father, Richard Davenport, now elderly and frail, could not shield her from the judgment of society. Marblewood, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, now seemed a mausoleum, echoing with memories of grandeur that no longer existed. All my jewels, all my gowns, all my dances, they mean nothing. They are chains. They weigh me down. The mirror's dominion. By this time, Clara's journal entries reflected her descent into obsession. She is no longer merely a reflection. She speaks. She mocks. She waits. Every mirror holds her now, not me. I am dissolved into her. Soon, I will step through and join her. The boundaries between reality and delusion blurred. Clara began to refuse meals, wandering the halls at night barefoot, her fingers trailing over the cold marble as though seeking comfort from the stones themselves. Servants reported seeing her standing before mirrors, her eyes wide and unblinking, whispering names that belonged to no one in the house. Occasionally, she would scream suddenly, startling them into silence. The first public breakdown, the tipping point, came during a small ball hosted by a minor social family. Clara arrived in a gown of midnight blue, her hair arranged perfectly, her expression calm. But as the evening progressed, she began speaking to mirrors on the walls as if they were companions. Do not touch her. She is mine. Guests froze, unsure whether to laugh, faint, or flee. Newspapers would later describe the incident as a shocking display of hysteria in the home of a once revered socialite. Richard Davenport was furious, but even his threats could not steady his daughter. By the time they returned home to Marblewood, Clara had retreated to her private chambers, barricading herself in and refusing to emerge for days. The toll: by age 31, Clara was a woman transformed. Society had stripped her of respect, Henry had stripped her of security, and the world she once commanded had become a cage. The only companions she had were the shadows in the mirrors and the figures that seemed to whisper to her from them. She wrote in her journal, "I am the swan no longer. I am a shadow. I am glass. I am the echo of myself. She waits for me, patient. Soon I will follow." The opulent world of the Gilded Age had exacted its price. Clara Davenport had lost not just her social standing, but the fragile grip on her own mind. Her descent into madness was no longer hidden. Society had abandoned her, her family could no longer intervene, and the figure in the glass waited, silent, inevitable, and victorious. By the mid-1890s, Clara Davenport's world had shrunk to the size of Marblewood and the obsidian mirrors that lined its halls. The grand balls, the elegant soirees, and the applause of society were gone. In their place stood silence, shadows, and the ever-present figure she called her. Even Henry Ashcroft, who once flaunted his wealth and dominance, had grown indifferent. He no longer tried to control Clara. She had become too unpredictable, too fragile, too dangerous for society or for him to manage. He left her to her obsessions, his attention diverted elsewhere, leaving Clara to navigate the labyrinth of her own mind. The mirror becomes reality. Clara's days blurred into nights. She spoke to the figure in her mirrors constantly, and eventually she stopped distinguishing reflection from reality. The presence whispered to her, taunted her, and sometimes promised release from her pain, if only she would follow. "I am here. I have always been here. You are mine," she wrote in her journal, the ink smeared from tears. Servants reported hearing her sing softly to herself, the lyrics unfamiliar, almost incantatory. Shadows in the hallways seemed to move in rhythm with her voice, and sometimes, fleetingly, she appeared to vanish from sight, only to reappear minutes later, pale and trembling. The social collapse news of Clara's breakdown spread, even beyond New York society. Reports in newspapers referred to the once celebrated Swan of Marblewood as a tragic figure, consumed by madness. Gossip reached every corner of the elite. Former friends avoided her completely. Invitations ceased. Henry's public image overshadowed hers, making her more isolated than ever. Even those who had once adored her beauty now whispered about her insanity, noting her wild eyes, her thin frame, and her constant, obsessive movements. The grandeur of her youth, the gowns, the jewels, the ballrooms, felt like distant illusions, mocking her from beyond. The night of the collapse, it was a winter evening when Clara's madness reached its pinnacle. Snow blanketed Marblewood's grounds, and the house was quiet except for the occasional crack of a fire. She wandered from room to room, speaking to mirrors, to shadows, to memories of her mother and father. She began breaking the mirrors, one by one, convinced that destroying their surfaces would weaken the presence inside. She shattered glass in her chambers, her drawing room, even the grand ballroom, until shards littered the floors. Yet the figure persisted. "You cannot escape me," Clara whispered, clutching a broken fragment to her chest. In a frenzy, she ran through Marblewood, pursued by the voices only she could hear. Servants dared not follow. They feared for their own sanity. The house, once a symbol of wealth and elegance, echoed with her screams, the sound bouncing endlessly off marble walls. Isolation absolute. When Henry returned briefly from one of his excursions, he found Marblewood silent. Clara was nowhere to be seen. He searched the house, calling her name, but only the shattered glass and a single journal remained, open on the grand staircase. "I follow her now. She waits. She is patient. Soon we will be together, and no one can touch us again." No one ever saw Clara emerge from Marblewood that night. Some say she fled into the snow and vanished. Others claim she retreated into the mirrors themselves, leaving her physical form behind. Society's fascination transformed into legend. The Swan of Marblewood became a cautionary tale whispered at dinner tables and in drawing rooms. A story of beauty, wealth, and madness consuming a life too fragile for the gilded cage of the Gilded Age. The last journal, the final entry in Clara's journal read, "I am free. She is free. We glide together now. The halls are ours. The mirrors sing. I am not lost, I am found. And they will not touch me again." After this, the journal ended abruptly, the last pages soaked with tears and ink, never to be finished. Legacy of tragedy. Clara Davenport's disappearance became one of New York's great unsolved mysteries. Marblewood fell into ruin, a decaying monument to wealth and sorrow. Historians later speculated that her mind had been broken by the relentless pressures of society, by her mother's decline, by the betrayal of Henry Ashcroft, and by the haunting figure that may have been real or entirely born of her fractured psyche. Her story lingered, a tragic emblem of the dangers hidden behind gilded walls. The fragility of beauty, the peril of obsession, and the inevitability of madness. When the soul is trapped in a cage, it cannot escape. Clara Davenport, the Swan of Marblewood, had flown her final flight, not into the world, but into the shadows that had always awaited her. After Clara Davenport's disappearance, Marblewood became a silent witness to tragedy. The once grand estate, which had dazzled New York society with its chandeliers, marble floors, and manicured gardens, now stood abandoned, its windows dark, its halls echoing with memories of laughter, music, and screams. Stories spread quickly. Servants who had once worked in the house swore they still heard the faint rustle of silk gowns at night, the echo of high-heeled steps along the marble floors, and whispers that carried through empty rooms. "She walks still," one former maid said. "The swan. She glides, even when no one is there." Society reacts. Society, once obsessed with Clara, now treated her story as legend. Newspapers ran accounts of Marblewood's supposed hauntings, embellishing every detail. Socialites whispered at tea parties about a pale figure glimpsed through frosted windows, or the sound of someone singing softly in the dead of night. Henry Ashcroft, who had largely ignored her during her decline, was rumored to have returned to Marblewood once, hoping to retrieve personal items. He left in haste, claiming that a cold wind had swept through the halls, carrying with it Clara's voice. The journals among the remnants of Marblewood were Clara's journals, fragments left behind during her final, frenzied flight. Historians later described them as both brilliant and chilling, filled with reflections of a mind straining under wealth, societal expectation, and obsession. One passage, often quoted in later accounts, read, "The mirrors hold her now. She waits. They will not touch me. We glide together forever." These writings fueled speculation. Had Clara truly vanished into madness, or had she found some other, inexplicable escape? The ghost in the mirror. Many who later entered Marblewood claimed to see Clara's reflection in mirrors where no one else was present. Some visitors reported hearing whispered warnings, shivers running down their spines as they passed empty rooms. Local children dared each other to peek through the gates, convinced that the Swan of Marblewood might appear to them. Tales of glowing eyes in the darkness, fleeting glimpses of a pale woman in a shattered gown, and distant, haunting laughter became folklore. Even the walls remember her, an elderly historian later wrote. The house itself seems to breathe with her absence. The estate decays without heirs or caretakers. Marblewood slowly fell into ruin. Gardens grew wild, fountains cracked and dried, and the marble floors darkened under layers of dust. Yet even in decay, the estate retained an aura of opulence and tragedy, as though the house mourned its lost mistress. Visitors claimed that at dusk, the echoes of Clara's life returned. The soft clink of crystal glasses, the rustle of silk, faint music from a long-forgotten piano. Some said it was only the wind. Others believed it was Clara herself, gliding through the shadows she had chosen as her final refuge. The legacy Clara Davenport became more than a cautionary tale. She became a symbol. Scholars and writers cited her story as an example of the dangers hidden beneath wealth and beauty. The psychological toll of societal pressure, the isolation behind gilded walls, and the haunting consequences of betrayal and obsession. Marblewood, even in ruin, drew curious visitors, paranormal investigators, and historians, each hoping to glimpse the Swan of Marblewood, or perhaps to understand her mind, fractured by the world she had once ruled. The house, like Clara, existed in two realms, a reality of stone and glass, and a shadowed realm of legend and fear. Years passed after Clara Davenport vanished from Marblewood. The once celebrated Swan of Marblewood had become a figure of legend, her story whispered in parlors, referenced in novels, and studied by historians fascinated by wealth, madness, and tragedy. Marblewood itself fell further into decay. Its grand halls, once filled with music and laughter, became overgrown with ivy and shadowed by neglect. Windows were boarded, fountains long dry, and statues cracked under time's relentless hand. Yet the estate retained an eerie presence, as if Clara herself still moved through its corridors. Society moves on while society largely moved on from the scandals of the Gilded Age. Clara's story remained a cautionary tale. The families who had once competed for her attention preserved her memory in hushed tones, warning their children of the perils of obsession and the fragility behind wealth. Henry Ashcroft remarried quickly, distancing himself from Marblewood and the past. He attempted to erase Clara's influence, but the estate refused to be forgotten. Rumors persisted, claiming that the Swan still haunted the house, gliding silently through its halls, a spectral figure in silk and shattered jewels. The Davenport line, Richard Davenport, Clara's father, died several years later, leaving Marblewood to distant relatives who had no attachment to its history. They attempted to renovate, sell, or repurpose the estate, but workers reported strange occurrences. Mirrors cracking spontaneously, disembodied whispers, and fleeting glimpses of a pale woman in the corners of rooms. Clara's mother, Eleanor, long gone, was remembered only in journals and fading portraits, while Clara's life, brilliance turned to tragedy, became the centerpiece of family lore, a dark shadow over the Davenport name. She took the light with her, a distant cousin noted, and the house will never forgive us for it. The legacy in literature writers and journalists of the time drew inspiration from Clara's story. Novels depicted heiresses driven to madness, women trapped in gilded cages, and figures whose beauty concealed inner torment. Clara became a symbol of the dangers of wealth, obsession, and societal expectation, immortalized in prose and speculation. Historians pored over her journals, attempting to decipher the truth. How much of her decline was psychological, how much driven by betrayal, and how much the result of supernatural forces she herself believed haunted her mirrors. Marblewood's haunting those brave enough to visit Marblewood after its abandonment reported unsettling phenomena. Shadows that moved independently of light, cold spots in rooms with no drafts, and the faint smell of roses in empty halls. Some claimed to hear Clara's voice, whispering warnings or secrets, urging intruders to leave her sanctuary. Ghost hunters and folklorists documented the sightings meticulously, but no one ever captured definitive proof of the Swan. Clara had become both legend and myth, a figure caught between reality and the supernatural. Cultural memory by the early 20th century, Clara Davenport was no longer known personally by society. She existed only in memory, journals, and tales passed down through generations. The Swan of Marblewood became shorthand for tragic beauty, a cautionary emblem of what wealth, isolation, and betrayal could do to a mind once brilliant and admired. Marblewood, in its ruin, served as a physical reminder of the cost of obsession, the weight of societal expectation, and the fragility hidden beneath outward splendor. As the 20th century dawned, Marblewood stood as a monument to both opulence and tragedy. Nature had begun reclaiming its grounds. Ivy crawled up the once pristine marble walls, fountains lay dry, and the gardens had become wild and untamed. Yet despite the decay, whispers persisted of a presence that refused to vanish, the Swan of Marblewood, Clara Davenport. Society had long moved on from the scandals of her youth, but her story endured. Writers, historians, and folklorists revisited the journals, letters, and fragments of her life, each trying to piece together the enigma of the woman who had been both adored and feared. Clara had become more than a person. She was a symbol, a cautionary tale of beauty, wealth, obsession, and the fragility of the human mind under societal pressures. Marblewood's eternal haunting visitors to the estate, whether historians or curious tourists, reported unsettling experiences. Footsteps echoed along empty corridors, the faint rustle of silk brushed past them, and mirrors seemed to hold a presence, reflecting a pale woman who was never there. Some claimed to hear whispers, soft but urgent, warning them to leave. Others swore they saw her glide across rooms in gowns that shimmered like moonlight. Local lore solidified Clara's spectral image. Children dared one another to peek through broken gates, convinced they would glimpse the swan. The house itself seemed alive with memory, breathing with her absence and presence simultaneously. The final journal among the preserved artifacts was Clara's last journal. Its pages, stained and brittle, captured the final moments of her consciousness. She wrote of the figure in the mirrors of liberation, and of the eternal glide she now shared with the presence she had long feared and adored. I am free. She is free. We glide together now. The halls are ours. No one can touch us again. I am not lost. I am found. This entry became the cornerstone of her legend, blurring the lines between reality and myth. Scholars debated whether Clara had truly vanished or if her mind had created an alternate reality in which she could escape the constraints and betrayals of her life. Cultural impact over the decades. Clara's story inspired novels, plays, and folklore. She became a recurring motif for the tragic heiress, the isolated genius, and the haunted beauty undone by society's pressures. Writers explored her psychological decline, her obsession with mirrors, and the relentless isolation that Marblewood imposed. Through these retellings, Clara Davenport's tale was immortalized, her name forever linked to mystery, opulence, and the dark side of the Gilded Age. Marblewood became a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by the interplay of wealth, beauty, madness, and myth. The legend endures even as Marblewood crumbled further. The swan's story persisted. Residents of the surrounding area claimed that on quiet nights, the sound of delicate footsteps could be heard across the frost-covered floors, accompanied by faint, ghostly music. Some believed the swan continued to glide, unseen yet present, eternally bound to the estate she had once ruled. She is not gone, a local historian wrote. She exists in the echoes, the reflections, the shadows, forever the Swan of Marblewood. Her tale became a lesson about the cost of societal expectation, the fragility of the mind, and the enduring power of myth to transform tragedy into legend. It too